Well, let's get more on Afghanistan now and speak to a man who, for a time, worked closely with Donald Trump on his foreign policy. I'm talking, of course, about John Bolton, the former US National Security Advisor and former US Ambassador to the United Nations. He joins us now from Washington. Thanks very much for being with us this evening, Mr. Bolton. Now, we've just heard from the US State Department that they have 6,000 people fully processed and awaiting to board planes in Kabul airport. Could you, in 2001, could you ever have imagined a scene where the US would be entirely reliant on the goodwill of the Taliban, essentially, to get people to planes to evacuate Afghanistan?
No, I think the decision to withdraw American and NATO forces was a catastrophic mistake. I think this has sacrificed a strategic objective we've had these last 20 years to prevent a repetition of the 9/11 attacks. I think that strategic objective remains valid. And I'm very worried, not just about what's going to happen in Afghanistan. I'm very worried about the implications of this mistake for the U.S. and the West as a whole. As our adversaries analyze what we've done here, I think we're going to pay for this for a long time.
Well, I'd like to come back to what you've just said there about how the US's adversaries might respond to this. But first, I want to ask you, whose fault is what's happened in the last week? Is it Donald Trump's or is it Joe Biden's?
Well, I think there are two questions here. The first question is, was it correct to withdraw American forces? I think the answer to that was no, but I think both Trump and Biden wanted to do that, have wanted to do it for a long time. And really, on that question, their opinions are like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. This is a Trump-Biden withdrawal. The second question, however, is the execution of the decision to withdraw. And that 7 months into his administration is entirely Biden's responsibility. I think it's been bungled terribly. So what was already one major mistake has taken on even graver consequences because of how poorly this whole effort has been conducted.
I mean, there is an argument that says that a successful intervention in any foreign country would surely create the conditions for a withdrawal, an eventual withdrawal. Looking at the situation in Afghanistan, it begs the question, was there ever in mind the intention to create the conditions that would have allowed a successful withdrawal?
Well, I think the answer to that question always depends on the circumstances you're facing. American troops entered Germany in 1945 and we're still there. Shall we get out? The question is not ours alone to answer. The question is the nature of the threat. And I believe we continue to face the threat of terrorist attacks emanating from Afghanistan, and giving the country back to Taliban almost inevitably, it seems to me, will result in al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terrorist groups taking privileged sanctuary there again, and that the risk of the threats will go up. It was always better to conduct forward defense in Afghanistan than to fight in the streets and skies over America. That hasn't changed, except now that's probably where we will have to fight.
And yet, alongside what you're talking about, the military side of things, there's also an intelligence failure here. I mean, it's hard to believe that after 20 years in Afghanistan, the US and its allies could have been so wrong-footed by the Taliban to think that it wouldn't be able to take over so quickly. Is this the biggest intelligence failure analysis or failure of intelligence analysis since the weapons of mass destruction failure in the early 2000s?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. I think we've certainly watched an administration that's guilty of congenital wishful thinking completely misapprehend the nature of the Taliban threat. And I think this is where Trump's policy comes into play as well. The Taliban have seen for a couple of years now that they've had American presidents who want to get out. And, you know, the Taliban have long had a saying, you have the watches, we have the time. It looks like the collapse occurred almost overnight, but Taliban have been working on this, seeing Trump's evident desire to get out for quite some time. This is the culmination of it. It's tragedy any way you cut it.
Mr. Bolton, you were one of the architects of that intervention, of these interventions in Iraq, in Afghanistan. You were one of those who supported intervention. How do you think it was allowed for the Taliban to be this powerful still 20 years later? I mean, that is, whichever way you spin it, that is a failure of the last 20 years.
Well, I don't agree with that. If we were still there, if it were clear that we had the will and the determination to stay, I don't think Taliban would have taken over the country. You know, it's like the keystone of an arch. You can build a very big, impressive arch, but if you take the keystone out, all you have is a pile of rocks. And when you removed U.S. intelligence for the Afghan army and security forces, when you removed U.S. air cover, and when you removed the confidence that we, the British, other NATO members gave to them, it's not surprising to see this. I must say, I obviously can't talk about intelligence that I've seen, but I can tell you that when you deprive an army of its morale, it doesn't matter what their equipment or training or leadership is. If they fear they're going to lose and they fear what the victors are going to do to them, they're going to melt away.
But what about the nature of the investment, the nature of the intervention in Afghanistan? Had it not been a corrupt government that had been put in place by the US, could we not have seen a stronger defense against the Taliban? Could we not have seen it much harder for the Taliban to take over?
Stop. We did not put a corrupt government in place. Corruption has existed in Afghanistan for a long time, and here's a news flash: under the Taliban, corruption will still exist. The U.S. interest and the interest of NATO as a whole was to prevent a terrorist takeover. We didn't have to reform Afghanistan. It was probably a mistake to try. But the real question when you say, but all these years...
I'd like to just jump in there, because it is a line, Mr. Bolton, it is a line we hear.
How much risk are you prepared to accept?
We hear a lot that from the US that Afghanistan was rife with corruption, but the US did nothing to stop that corruption. I'd just like to talk about the last speaker of the Afghan parliament. He's a multimillionaire, and that is thanks to monopoly contracts to provide fuel and security to US forces at Bagram, the main air base. The US certainly did nothing to stop corruption.
Well, that's simply not true. But let me ask you a question. And I wish you would let me finish so that we could have this discussion. How much risk are you prepared to accept for a terrorist attack on London?
Mr. Bolton, you know full well that I am not in command of a country of any sort. This is not a question for me to answer. This is a question for our political leaders to answer, and this is not how the interview works. Look, by your own measures of success, which you have claimed to be to stop the Taliban, to stop al-Qaeda from regaining a capability to have a privileged sanctuary from which they could plan and direct attacks on countries like the US, by those very metrics, the mission in Afghanistan failed. I just would like to know again, how was it allowed to fail?
It failed because of the decisions by Trump and Biden to withdraw. For the last 7 or 8 years, we were muddling along quite well without terrorist attacks. The measure of success is not whether Afghanistan has been turned into the Switzerland of Central Asia. The issue is whether we are protecting our civilian populations. And since the tragedy of September the 11th, there have been no terrorist attacks on the United States conducted out of Afghanistan by al-Qaeda or anything else. I call that a success.
Is the war on terror over?
Of course not. As I indicated before, because of this catastrophic decision to withdraw, we now face, I would say, the likelihood of a return of the terrorist threat. And that's why all of these measures, all these things you're talking about the corruption of Afghan society and the faults of the Afghan people, I'm very sorry for the Afghan people. But let's be clear, the United States and NATO did not go into Afghanistan to conduct charity for the people there. They've gained a lot of collateral benefits from our presence, and I'm glad that they got them. But we're there to protect our own innocent civilians, and we have succeeded in doing that up until this withdrawal.
Okay. I'll put it to you another way then, maybe. Cambodia, Vietnam, the Kurds in Syria, and now Afghanistan. Why is it that the US is such a bad ally?
Well, I think that, you're completely mischaracterizing very, very different circumstances. How did Germany and Japan feel about America as an ally? These are issues that you have to take under their own circumstances. And I'd be happy to take them for as long as you want to talk. But to run up a list like that as if that's a complete list of what American policy had consisted of is a total distortion of reality.
You will admit, though, that it would be hard for other potential allies to see themselves. I mean, we keep hearing from interpreters in Afghanistan who say, I would not let my children work with the US if they came back into Afghanistan, because we know what that means now, that you'll work with them and you'll be abandoned. It would be easy to see why future allies might not want to work with the US. Because we are running out of time.
Answer that question, or is that you said you don't?
Do you know what? No, okay, you can. You can. You absolutely can. We're short on time, but please do.
Well, thank you. That proves the point that we should not have withdrawn.
It is an enormous strategic setback for the US, what we've seen happening, the scenes we've seen unfolding over the last couple of weeks in Kabul. You could say, I mean, I hate to draw comparisons, I know you don't like them, but it is as big, almost a humiliation as Vietnam was for the USA. How emboldened do you think, and you touched on this at the beginning of the interview, will the USA's strategic competitors, I'm thinking of China, I'm thinking of Russia, how emboldened will they be by what they've seen?
Well, I think it's a mistake because it says to our adversaries that the Biden administration is weak. And I don't think that's where the American people are. There are polls that show just this weekend that when asked if you knew that American withdrawal would lead to Taliban coming back into power, if American withdrawal would lead to attacks from al-Qaeda, would you still favor withdrawal? And the answer is no. So this is a mistake in policy. It's always a tragedy when America makes a mistake like this, but it does not, I think, determine inevitably what the future will be. That's why we have elections in this country.
John Bolton, former US National Security Advisor, thank you so much for being with us here tonight on Sky.